Today, we're digging into a fascinating legal mystery, one that comes from a war that once had the entire world watching. It's a story about a huge lawsuit, the highest court on the planet, and a final verdict that, well, never actually happened. All right, so here's the puzzle. In the middle of the Kosovo War, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia takes 10 NATO countries to the International Court of Justice. They wanted a clear ruling on whether the bombing was legal. But that ruling never came. The case just got thrown out. So the big question we're going to answer today is why? So let's set the scene. It's the spring of 1999. NATO's bombing campaign is in a full swing. The Yugoslav government decides to fight back, but not just on the ground. They decided to take the fight to the courtroom. On April 29th, they walked right into the Peace Palace in The Hague and filed their case. And the accusations they brought were, incredibly serious. We're talking illegal use of force, messing with their internal affairs, violating their sovereignty, harming civilians. The list goes on. But then they added one more charge, a charge that would end up being the key to this entire story: acts of genocide. Now, Yugoslavia didn't want to wait years for a decision. They wanted the bombing stopped right then and there. So they made an emergency request to the court, basically asking it to order an immediate halt to the entire military campaign while the bigger case was being sorted out. In legal speak, this is called a request for provisional measures. You can think of it like a temporary injunction in a normal court case. It's the World Court hitting a giant pause button on a war to prevent any more damage while they figure out the legal side of things. But to get that, Yugoslavia had to convince the court it had a good reason to even hear the case. And the hook they used to get the court's attention was the Genocide Convention. Look at the specific language they used. They argued the bombing was deliberately creating conditions meant to physically destroy the Yugoslav national group. I mean, that is a huge, powerful claim designed to make it impossible for the court to look away. But the court wasn't buying it. In its first look at the case in 1999, it basically said, look, to prove genocide, you have to prove a very specific intent to destroy a group. And the court decided that, at least at this early stage, the bombing itself didn't show that kind of intent. So the request for that emergency stop, rejected. First hurdle, failed. Okay, so the emergency request is off the table, and the case moves forward. But it doesn't move on to the big question of whether the bombing was legal. Nope. Instead, the whole thing pivots to a much more basic, almost boring procedural question. Did Yugoslavia even have the right to be in the World Court to begin with? To really get this, you have to understand the golden rule of the World Court. Think of it like a super exclusive club. Rule 1, only states can sue other states. Rule 2, to even file a lawsuit, you have to be a member of the club, a party to the court's founding treaty. And how do you do that? Well, the main way is by being a member of the United Nations. If you don't have that UN membership card, the doors to the courtroom are pretty much locked. And this is where the whole case gets incredibly weird and complicated. See, after the old Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia broke up back in 1992, there was this big fight over the new Yugoslavia status. Yugoslavia insisted it automatically inherited the old country's UN seat. The UN, on the other hand, said, no way, you can't just continue it. You have to apply all over again as a new member. This standoff created this bizarre legal limbo that went on for 8 years. The court itself used some amazing words to describe the situation, calling Yugoslavia's status ambiguous, amorphous, and my personal favorite, sui generis, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying it was a complete one-of-a-kind mess. For almost a decade, nobody knew for sure if they were a UN member or not. So this legal fog just hangs over the case for years. Then, finally, in 2004, the court is ready to give its answer. Not on the war, remember, but on this fundamental question of membership. And its conclusion was actually stunningly simple. Just look at this timeline. So in 92, the UN says you have to reapply. In 99, Yugoslavia files its lawsuit, still arguing that it's a continuing member. But then, and this right here is the absolute key moment, in October 2000, after some political changes at home, Yugoslavia went and formally requested admission to the United Nations as a new member. And right there, that's the aha moment. The court's logic was just so simple and so brilliant. By asking to join as a new member in the year 2000, Yugoslavia basically admitted that it wasn't a member before that. And, well, if it wasn't a member in 2000, it sure as heck wasn't a member when it filed the lawsuit back in 1999. And just like that, the case was dismissed. The court never even touched the actual substance of the war. It decided it didn't have the power, the jurisdiction, to even listen to the arguments. It was a total procedural knockout before the main event could even start. So, what does this all mean?
I mean, why does a procedural issue, a technicality, matter so much when you're talking about war and peace? Well, it tells us something really fundamental about how international justice actually works.
And here is the key takeaway from this whole story. In the world of international law, procedure is everything. The rules of the game, who is allowed to play and on which court, that stuff gets decided way before you ever get to talk about what the game is actually about. You have to get a yes on jurisdiction before the court will even look at the real substance, the merits of a case. But hold on, there is one last twist to this story. While all 15 judges agreed that the case should be dismissed, they were seriously split on why. 8 of the judges went with that complicated UN membership reasoning we just talked about. But the other 7? They thought there was a much, much simpler way to do it. These 7 judges basically argued, hey, why are we making this so complicated? They said the court should have just stuck with its original 1999 finding. They had already decided they didn't have jurisdiction based on the Genocide Convention, so why not just make that the final answer? It would have been cleaner, it would have avoided that whole messy membership debate, and it wouldn't have set a weird precedent for future cases. In its final judgment, the court actually included this really powerful reminder. It said that just because its courtroom doors are closed on a procedural issue, that doesn't mean accountability just disappears. Under international law, states are always responsible for their actions. And that leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. This case is a perfect example of the massive hurdles that exist in international law. And it forces us to ask, if the world's highest court can be closed because of a technicality, where does a nation, or its people, go to find justice?